It's time to take command with former NFL tight end Logan Paulsen and former Commanders beat reporter Craig Hoffman.
What's up? What's happening? Welcome in draft review edition of Take Command. He is Logan Paulsen. I am Craig Hoffman. And Logan, let us dive right in. We will go through each and every one of the Commanders' picks. We don't have to do like a letter grade per se, but kind of an overall thoughts, grades. We like it, we don't like it on the players selected over the last 3 days. And also, I think with the way we start, even though we already talked a lot about Emmanuel Forbes, I want to be able to put Forbes in context of the rest of the draft now that we've seen it. And also kind of update, because I've watched him more, obviously. Now that we know he's the guy, you spend a little more time on him. You read a little bit more up on him. And I'll say this, at least for me, Logan, like the pick has grown on me tremendously over these last couple of days. The 166 number is the highlight, or not the highlight, is the headline that grabs everyone's attention. But that was his combine weight. And like, if he has the ability to get down to that, to run a 4.3 at the combine, fine. But he ultimately is going to play heavier than that. He probably is already heavier than that. He definitely played heavier than that. And I think the biggest thing for me, Logan, is like flipping on the tape. You go, all right, which ones, if you didn't have like the guy circled, as a lot of the tape breakdowns on YouTube and such do, so you don't find him. You're like, all right, I want you to find Emmanuel Forbes on the field by which one's the skinny guy. You'd have no real shot at doing it. Like, he doesn't look small on tape. And I think, as silly as that is, because we have the number, like that matters a lot. And it tells me that he plays at a bigger weight. The size isn't going to be that huge of an issue. And I think also in the context of seeing them draft Quan to play nickel, like this is their outside corner CB1 of the future. And I think it's a great selection for that because he's a ball hawk player who the likes they haven't had since at least D'Angelo Hall.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And I think, in the last video, I read some of the comments and some people were like, oh, you guys don't like the pick. Like, I love the pick. I think I said this on the show, like his film is the best of everybody in that top group outside of Witherspoon, right? So he's an excellent football player. He's a physical tackler. He's instinctive. He probably played in the most similar scheme to what Washington plays. A lot of zone. They sprinkle in some man. A lot of coverages where you can play with eyes to the quarterback. Like you mentioned, there's the ball production. I think the ball production is slightly inflated, but I do think it's indicative that he's around the football a lot, right? Has the great recovery speed. So I love the pick. I mean, it's a great pick. Maybe you could argue at 16, could they have got him if they tried to trade back? They probably could have, but I also think they did try to trade back, and it just didn't happen.
100%.
And like we've talked,
and look, I'll say this real quick, Logan. I'm sorry to cut you off, but like the Jets very clearly were trying to trade back. They were the pick before. Yeah. Like they used every bit of their time and took a guy that everyone agreed, like, it's a good pick, but you really like to trade back. The Jets tried. And if they couldn't trade back at 15, why on earth would the Commanders have been able to at 16? Like it's not feasible to throw that on them and downgrade them because they got stuck in their draft slot because there was no one there to trade up for.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think, and so if that's your criticism, I mean, sometimes that happens. Sometimes you just can't move the spot. And I know they tried and they just weren't able to. And I think, we've talked about this before. If that's your guy, that's your number one guy at that spot, don't trade back. You know what I mean? Like if you've tiered that out, he's the number one guy in that tier, don't trade back. And so either way, even if they couldn't, whatever, if that's your number one guy, don't. And so I think like you end up with a really good football player and a guy that's going to hopefully make this defense a lot better. Obviously he's got to come in and play and we got to see what's going on with that. But every indication of his career, of his film, of his interview that we did with him the other day, like he is a guy that's wired appropriately mentally. Football is very important to him. He's played football at a high level for a very long time. Like I don't want to say it's a surefire thing, but like in the grand scheme of surefire picks, it's about as surefire as you get. And the only little asterisk is the 166. And like you said, like he played for 4 years in the SEC at a very high level, very physical brand of football, and has no injury history to speak of. Is it 3 years or 4 years? Whatever. It's a long time.
3 years, yeah.
Yeah, whatever it is, long time. So that's what I would say is and he's already bigger. Like in the interview we did on our pre-draft coverage when he came in on Saturday, he already said he's 175. So like he's already put on weight. That's probably more close to what he plays at. That's still not a great number, but I think it's a number that you can work with. And I think he's aware. He's a guy that's going to take care of himself and get in the right position. So I like the pick a lot, basically, is the end of that.
Yeah, no, I like it a lot too, and I mean, I'm watching him a little bit, over the weekend, like, you had mentioned he plays a little high sometimes, plays, like, a little, forward in his back pedal, and you can see that, right? But you also see it get better and kind of his body control get better over time. Like, I watched a couple of cut-ups, one of which was against Alabama his freshman year against Devontae Smith. Well, it didn't go great for Emmanuel Forbes
Yeah,
because Devontae Smith was the Heisman Trophy winner and Emmanuel Forbes was a freshman. But you watch then him against Jamison Williams the next year, and it's a lot better. And,
yeah,
and you see him then get his play last year in his final year at Mississippi State, and the technique just continues to get refined over time. The athletic, stuff shows off, and even when he does get a little mixed up with some of his footwork, like he's willing to like spin and stuff in space that I don't think is exactly
right.
your textbook technique. You don't necessarily want to be spinning with receivers, but he's got the makeup speed that he can get away with some of that stuff. And sometimes you wonder if it's controlled and is he baiting quarterbacks? So he's got to learn if he can do that ever at the NFL level, or is that a part of his game that goes away? He's still going to be around the ball. He's going to get targeted. That's for sure. That's part of being in the NFL. And the question you mentioned, the interception stuff might be a little bit inflated. I'm curious why you say that, but to me, what it says is like if you give him opportunities, he's going to make plays on the ball. But I'm
Yeah.
curious why you say that. Why you think that production might be a little bit inflated?
Yeah, I just think like there's some interceptions that are him, like he's making a play. Like there's the play, everyone saw like where he's picking off like a bubble screen that Will
Yeah, against
Levis.
Kentucky. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean it's a great play. Anticipates the throw, recognizes formation, all those great things. And there's a couple where it's like, he's breaking on a football and the quarterback, it's college quarterback play, so it's not great. Leaves the ball really inside and basically throws it right to him. Or they're throwing a big out and they underthrow it and he's right there underneath, and like an NFL quarterback probably has the ability to get that over top for a completion. Now he's not in a bad spot, but like if you go through all eight of his interceptions, I think 6 or 8, whatever it is, even
I think
number,
it's
and
6.
that
Yeah,
yeah, if you go through all of them, I'd say 4 or 5 of them are kind of like that, where it's like kind of poor. Like there's another one where the quarterback throws the ball behind the receiver. The receiver is falling down and basically flips it up in the air and it goes right to him. So that's 3 interceptions where it's kind of like, and then there was another one where it's a fake screen. He bites on it, is able to recover. The quarterback underthrows it, and he makes a really nice play on the ball. But if that ball is where it's supposed to be, it's probably a PBU as opposed to an interception. So I think that's kind of what I'm talking about. It's not, again, like obviously can catch the football well. He's obviously in the right position. He obviously
right,
has good vision. He tackles well. But I personally I've always been a believer that interceptions and sacks are not great indicators of production. The statistics go up and down pretty dramatically. So don't be like, oh, he's going to have 6 interceptions here. He's going to be around the football. He's going to put himself in a good position, and he can catch the football if the ball's there. I think that's a better way to look at
right.
it.
Yeah, totally. But by the same token, like a bunch of other dudes play in the SEC. There's been thousands, hundreds of thousands
Right.
of FBS players in the history of the sport, and nobody's had more pick sixes than Emmanuel Forbes. And so, those guys were also playing college quarterbacks. Those guys were also
Right.
doing all this stuff. And so,
So
I
it's
think I
again,
think to
that's not
your
a
point though, it's just like he makes the most of the opportunities
right.
in a way that's better. But there's going to be opportunities that were available to him in college that are not going to be there in the pros. So if you're expecting 10 interceptions out of him in a 17-game season, like let's tamper down your expectations a bit.
Yeah, and I just think like that's a really you worded that very well. That's exactly what I'm saying. It's not an indictment of him. It's more of an indictment of the media's obsession with these kind of random statistics. And I think like for sacks, pressure rate is a better indicator, and I think pass
Mm,
breakups are a better indicator for corners. And he's very good in that statistic as well. So it's not like I just don't love those statistics as measures of good cornerback play. I think like who's the DB in Dallas?
Diggs, yeah,
Diggs,
Trevon
he gets a
Diggs.
lot of interceptions, but he's also kind of playing the risk reward game at a very, very high level, and he puts himself in bad spots, and he gives up more yardage than any other DB in the NFL. You're okay with that because he turns the ball over, but is he a top 10 DB because he gives up the most yardage? You know what I'm saying? It's just like there
Right.
it lives in an ecosystem. It's not just one stat. But I love him. I love the pick. I think he's an excellent football player. Really impressed with him as a young man. And you mentioned the Devontae Smith thing. So in the interview, Fred was like, "Is there somebody you're really looking forward to playing?" And zero, I thought he was going to say AJ Brown, CD Lamb, you know, anybody. I had no idea what he was going to say, but he goes, "I want to play Devontae Smith because he scorched our team for 250 yards my freshman year, and I want like that's a fluke, and I just love that competitive, like eagerness, and like the quiet confidence that he had. So in terms of the guy, great guy. In terms of the film, great film. I think it's a great pick. So
Definitely. All right, let's go to Quan Martin, the second rounder, Jartavius, aka Quan Martin. He
Quan.
goes by Quan, so we will call him Quan. And then I want to kind of circle back and reset the corner depth chart
Yeah.
going into the spring because I think both these guys are going to be starters on it. What do you make of Quan Martin? Both of going back to back corner. Obviously, Martin's a nickel, but going back to back corner and the player himself.
Yeah, so I think Quan is more of a. You mentioned nickel. I think that's 100% right. He is a nickel, but he's also a post safety. Plays box safety. He's a guy that literally, I think, fits this defense's vision of what a safety can and should do at an extremely high level. Like he literally can play, the two safety spots. He can play the nickel. I don't think you want him living as the Buffalo nickel, but he did do that a little bit um, at Illinois, right? And then he even had a couple games, I think it was Michigan, where he plays outside as an outside corner. So you just got a guy who's very instinctive, very tough, and just an excellent football player. So I think having a piece like that is really important, right? Because it allows you to kind of say, hey, much in the same way that there's position flex along the offensive line, it's like, how do we get the best four guys out on the field? And I think, right now it's like, hey, Cam Curl can play the box safety. He can play the post, or he can play the post and Cam can play he can play the box and Cam can play the post. And it's just, I really like the pick because he's good at all the things. So, again, like much like Emmanuel Forbes, he was a very productive college player with excellent tape, quality human being, right? Which you can tell was very important to them because literally every one of these guys, I don't know KJ Henry, but and Christian Rodriguez has some issues, but all of
Yeah,
them, all the
Henry
top.
was like a team captain. Dabo
Right.
raves about him.
So we talk about like how that was really important to them. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
And Andre Jones, the last guy, was a team captain as well. So it's like that was a big thing. He is that type of guy. So great guy, great film, position flex, tough football player. And he's very quick and instinctive, and I like him a lot. And again, people say, is it a need? I looked at that time when he was picked. He was the best person I had on my board. The offensive lineman had kind of gone through a little bit of a run. The edges had kind of gone through a little bit of a run, and he was far and away the best player. So I know they liked him, and it just seems to make a lot of sense to me that he's the pick at whatever it was, 47.
yeah. I'm going to update the graphic here, Logan, for those watching on YouTube. We're going to go from cornerback Quan Martin to DB Quan
There we
Martin
go. I like
because
that. Much better.
he is a guy that, while kind of I think is going to be slotted in to start at the nickel. You mentioned that position flex, and people are starting to get kind of angry about the
Tired of
position
it.
flex
Yeah.
thing on the offensive line, and I get it. Like with the offensive line, you can only play one position at once, and like you need a left tackle, you need a left guard, you need a center, you need a right guard, you need a right tackle on every single play. You don't interchange. That's not true in defensive back situations.
Correct.
And especially in the modern NFL with so much motion. If you can have him on one side, like lined up over a nickel, and then there's a quick motion and Cam Curl, and he can exchange responsibilities and he can drop back into the post, like that's really advantageous as opposed to feeling like you need to shift your entire formation because he can't handle certain responsibilities and Cam can't handle certain ones. Like you can just have the guys do this quick rotation, and everyone knows and understands exactly how that works, and it simplifies your defense. Like you don't need to have one guy per position on that back end, especially in your safeties and your nickels when you're in that Buffalo. Or frankly, like if he also if he's kind of got that safety build, you eliminate some of the need for the Buffalo. All the Buffalo is just having a safety play your nickel spot. And so if you can have a nickel who's technically a corner who also is fitting your safety spot, like you just keep him on the field most of the time.
Right.
And I think that's really valuable. So with that said, you have Quan Martin, I think, is probably going to enter camp. Like, I mean, I guess technically they're probably not going to give it to him. Like, I'd imagine, like, I wouldn't be surprised if the first snap in August goes to Danny Johnson out of respect for Danny because he's a vet, unless Martin is just clearly the better player all spring long. But certainly when they go to OTAs here next week or 2 weeks, whatever it is, like, Martin's Danny probably gets the first snap, and as Martin learns the defense, he's got a great chance to go in. But let's say by the time we're like in the middle of training camp and starters really start to clear themselves, what do you think the depth chart looks like inside and outside at corner for this team?
Yeah, so if I was just putting money on it, just based off film, and obviously there's a little bit of projection, but I think Forbes starts outside. I think Benjamin St. Juste starts outside, and then I think I really believe that you're probably looking at Cam Curl and Quan starting at safeties, and then maybe Percy Butler as like your Buffalo nickel,
Where does
or
Forrest fit in?
I think Forrest, I think maybe moves into like a true. So they I was talking to the safety coach a couple days ago, and they do have a different categorization for the Buffalo nickel, and I think Forrest fits that better than anyone else on the roster. Now he didn't feel comfortable doing it last year. He was much better off the ball, like in that quarters look. But if he can grow and kind of address that physicality into that Buffalo nickel role, I do think he becomes that guy for you. And I think that would be great. And I think Percy has some nickel skills, but then again, like because of the flexibility, you can say, I think Percy's outstanding in the post. He's awesome in the post. So let him play the post, and then Quan can play the nickel when they're all in the field together. So I think that's what's nice about this is that you elevate the back end by saying Forrest is best at this, Percy's best at this, and Cam's best at this, and we can take reps off Cam. I think that was a big part of this pick as well, is because Cam's been hurt the past 2 years, and the defense tanks when he's not in there. So can we take some of those kind of box plays off of his plate? And I think you have two guys in Percy and Forrest who can do that. And I think Quan can do that. It's just about finding, and again, that's why the pick is so perfect for the back end of this defense. Allows you to keep Cam healthy and allows you to get speak to those other young guys' skill sets at a really, really high level, because I think they're really high on those guys as well. And so now it's like, now we can just bring the best people to the party, put them in the best positions to be successful. So I do think it'll be kind of an amalgamation there of skill sets. But I think you're going to get the best from all four of those guys, and they're going to play a lot. So obviously, the odd man out here is kind of Kendall Fuller, and I think he might get the first crack at nickel. But I think when all the dust settles, it'll look like a version of those four safeties filling out those back end spots.
Yeah, I agree. I'm still not convinced that Kendall's on the roster by the time opening day comes around.
I'm not saying he is, but I'm just saying
Yeah,
like I like
like
always
they'll give him
yeah,
a shot, and he
right.
deserves that. And
Yes.
Kendall Fuller, I think we need to separate two things, right? We need to separate the contract and the football player. Kendall Fuller did a good job last year. He had a
Yep.
good season, like full stop. He had some
Yep.
plays made on him. He wasn't great. He shouldn't have gotten Pro Bowl nods. He should have been
Yep.
All Pro consideration. But like Kendall Fuller was a good football player last year. He made a lot of plays. He helped win them some games. Certainly got plays made on him. Some of them were just incredible plays by the
Right.
receivers where he's in good position. Um, but he also can save you $8 million if you cut him in a summer where you're trying to extend Cam Curl, and
Right.
you might be trying to do something with Montez Sweat potentially. Like there's a lot of moving pieces here. And now, as we'll get to, like Chase Roulier also could save you a lot of money, and I think he's probably very likely to have something happen
Seems that
with his
way. Yeah.
contract, whether it's a restructure or whether it's just a flat out cut. Like we'll see. But Fuller, that if you cut him, like you save $8.5 million, and at this point, I think that makes a lot of mathematical sense. I'm not saying they have to. I'm not saying it's irresponsible if they don't. I would love if Kendall stayed around because he's a vet who knows how to play. He knows how to study. He'd be a great influence on that room. And as we've talked about extensively on this podcast, there are not enough veterans in the NFL. There
Yeah.
are not enough guys who are in rooms to be kind of quasi coach leader types.
Mentor.
And Kendall Fuller,
right.
absolutely. But Kendall's also not, I don't even know if he's 30 yet. So it's not like he's
Yeah.
ancient. He would be a great influence on that room. But I do wonder if he winds up not just being odd man out of the rotation, but potentially odd man out in terms of the roster as well, as you try to put that together and think about special teams and all that kind of stuff. But he'll absolutely be around for the spring, or at least to start it, and then you go from there. At least I would think.
I think you said that really nicely because, like, he did a fine. It wasn't great. It wasn't bad. It was kind of right in the middle. And there's a lot of people who live right in the middle in the NFL. And I like Kendall. He's a good dude. I played with him as a rookie, and he says hi to me around the building. Awesome guy. But
Great
this is
dude.
one of the kind of the dark sides of the NFL, right? And usually when you're bringing in this type of draft capital and this kind of quality player, and both of these guys have high upsides, Quan and Emmanuel, like you're kind of like, well, someone's got to go, and that's tough and that's sad, but ultimately that's the sad truth of this business. So we'll see what happens, but I definitely think that is a possibility, and it's a more acute a possibility now than it was obviously before the draft. So
Right, right. And by the way, these kinds of things can also work in your favor. There's a guy starting at left tackle right now that the Commanders got a couple years ago because the Bears did the
that's
same
right.
exact thing. And so, as we move to the offensive line here in a second, people are mad that they didn't draft certain positions there. They're not done signing guys. Just
Right.
as they'll let guys go, they'll ultimately probably bring a couple of more guys in. Take Command podcast from Odyssey Sports. I'm Craig Hoffman. He is Logan Paulson. All right, Logan, let's get to round 3. And your guy, Ricky Stromberg, center out of Alabama. Arkansas, sorry. Out of Arkansas, SEC. Very burgundy-esque color. Doesn't have to change the color scheme too much.
Right.
What do we think about Ricky Stromberg, and is he your starting center? Maybe not going into camp because they probably let Nick Gates potentially do that, or Tyler Larson, like based off veteran hierarchy. But by day 3 of camp, by week 2 of camp, are we seeing Ricky Stromberg as the starting center?
Yeah, I really liked Ricky's film. I thought he was almost in that kind of Tippmann, Schultz, the kid from Minnesota. He was almost in
Mhm.
that tier of guy. Whippler, he was kind of I had Whippler in that tier, and obviously the NFL didn't agree with me, but he was very close to that tier. He was definitely like the fourth center, and I thought he was a very good football player, good athlete, big guy, and I think that's something they prioritize. Is because when I talked to guys at the combine, they were like, "Oh, we like big centers or whatever." So he fits the mold. I wonder about his high end athleticism, but I think he's athletic enough to play center. I think he's a smart guy, shows up on film, and he's tough and nasty and he's gritty. And I think he's, again, understands angles at a high level. Ron said he thinks he could play guard. I don't necessarily agree with that. He played guard as a freshman. Usually, if you're playing guard as a freshman, you move to center, it's because there's like a hip strength issue that prevents you from being truly excellent at guard. And I think he's got a little bit of that, little stiff in the hips, that prevents him from having that elite kind of guard bend. But I think he's a center. He's a good center. I think it's a little interesting that you have 4 centers on the roster right now. And I talking with people on the beat. One of the things they said is that, hey, they've had a lot of injuries at center, and they really value the center position. So me personally, if I'm making a team, I don't value the center quite as much, just because I feel like I want a guard to play that. And I want to teach his Sadiq how to snap. I want something like that. But he's an excellent football player, fits the mold of the kind of guy they're looking for. And from what I understand, has played a ton of football in the SEC. And again, like if you look at the list, man, playing a lot of football against high level of competition with a leadership role, that's something we previewed on our show, and they seem to be following that game plan to a T here.
No doubt about it. And you mentioned the injury things the last couple of years. Like this is the time of the year where there's 90 guys on the roster. When
Yep.
push comes to shove and they have to narrow it down. And with the new CBA, like I think it takes like this starts this year. You go straight to 53. So you're going to
Right.
have a bunch of guys, which I actually like because
Right.
you have that guy that gets hurt in the 3rd week of camp and you're already past the first round of cuts. And all of a sudden you're trying to bring a guy back, but you had to cut him. He signed somewhere else. And you've invested an entire spring and couple weeks of your fall into a guy. And it's like, oh crap, well, there went our depth. To be able to keep 90 guys until the last possible second, I actually kind of like. And now that cut day is going to be brutal. But I don't have a problem with them going a little heavier at that position, considering and having a bunch of guys ready, considering the issues they've had the last couple of years. Realistically, though, same conversation about Chase Roulier as we just had about Kendall. In terms of the contract,
Yeah.
Chase, you add in the fact that nobody really knows if he's going to be able to really play. He's barely played the last couple of years, and these injuries have been pretty devastating by all accounts. So, this is your guy of the future. If he can overtake Larson, who they played a lot better when Larson was in last year. Like part of the reason the O-line fell apart last year was because they got past Roulier and then past Larson.
Right.
That's where their issues came in when Nick Martin came in and just wasn't up to that task.
Right.
And a couple other guys I feel like might have even played last year. But if you can get a guy in Stromberg ready, and he's anchoring that center spot, and you can get him some reps with Sam. They've got the coverage stuff taken care of. That to me is the biggest question. Is like you've got a second year quarterback and now a rookie center in a brand new offense to everybody. how do the line calls work? How do they make sure that they have their protection set? Because that was also an issue last year. And part of the reason, like everyone wants to crush Charles Leno because of the Giants game. And it's like, well, they had a bunch of bad line calls in that game,
Right.
and Leno was
Or
doing his job, and he was
yeah.
that job was unfortunately to leave someone unblocked who ultimately sacked the quarterback by running right past him. And so making sure that that stuff is covered is important. And I don't know how EB runs it, whether it's a center or base system or a quarterback based system. But the
Right.
fact that both those guys are going to be young is an obvious question mark, but not a it's not a deal breaker by any means. Put it that way.
Sure. Sure, yeah, and it it is a little interesting, to have all those centers stockpiled, and like you mentioned, Chase, his future is probably in question now more than ever. I also think it's interesting that because I do think they believe that Nick Gates is more of a center. So, you brought this guy in free agency and you paid him a decent amount of money. So, I think that's also an interesting thing. Just the dynamic of that group now, because I do think Larson is probably more of a center only. And again, I'm not. My experience with that position is that it's very rare to carry true centers on the roster. You're always carrying kind of flex guys. And like I said, I have some questions about his ability to flex. Like the size is there to flex, but I wonder about, how he is. And they'll probably get him some reps and we'll know pretty early on if he can do it. But I just think it's a very unique situation. But in terms of Ricky, I think he's a good football player, and I'm happy he's a Commander.
Definitely. All right. So let's do kind of the same thing we did at corner. Let's go ahead to the fourth round. Let's talk about Braeden Daniels, and then let's kind of shuffle the pieces. Where are we along the offensive line? What do you make of the Daniels pick?
So this one was one of the tougher picks for me in the draft, and again, like I've grown on it since my initial evaluation. But he was one of the first guys that I watched in the draft process. When I say first, he was probably one of my first 20 guys, and I remember watching him at Utah, and you saw some really high level explosion, some really high level athleticism, but he was very inconsistent. And I kind of thought the only way that he makes it is if he moves into guard. So when they made this pick, I was like, he's got to play guard or center. He's a tackle convert, much like Sam Cosmi will be. And I thought, man, that is very, very redundant. Like you have now all these developmental guards, guys from different positions that have upside, obviously, but definitely aren't quite there yet. And then Ron gave his presser and said that basically Travell Wharton thought he could play tackle with the right kind of coaching and kind of cleaning up some of his footwork stuff. And I have a lot of respect for Travell. He's played a long time. He's a smart guy. He's got a good head for football. So I said, well, if Travell thinks that, I'm going to go give it another look. Because I'd also talked to a lot of my O-line buddies around the league, and two of them out of the three guys I talked to said they don't think he can make it unless he's playing center. So obviously not big ringing endorsements for this player. So last night I went back and I was like, I'm just going to grind some tape. And I took about 2 hours and I watched him exclusively. And what stood out to me is that he has really, really, really top flight athletic qualities. And so when you're looking at tackle specifically, you say, do they have the length or do they have the athleticism? Now, he's not a long player. He's got 33-inch arms. He's 6'4". He's 295 pounds. So not a big, long guy, but his foot speed is tremendous. And he does stuff every couple of plays. You're like, that is elite NFL tackle play. He's doing it in the Pac-12. He's doing it against kind of lesser competition, but he does have these flashes where you're like, that's pretty special. And the footwork and the foot speed, I shouldn't say footwork because that's a different thing, but the foot speed and quickness and the athleticism in his feet is tremendous. So like there's a play, for example, where he's on a backside cutoff on a B block and the linebacker tears out of there. And he actually runs the linebacker down, kind of does that Trent Williams reach around block, and is able to get to his front side and seal it off and let the running back hit it for a 20-yard gain. Like that is elite athleticism at the position. There's another one where he sets the three technique because he's expecting a stunt. He gets speed off the edge from the defensive end, and his feet are just magically fast. He's able to get back, block the guy up. He delivers a really good kind of explosive pop from the hips in short areas, so he's able to create a lot of movement. But he does miss a lot. You know what I mean? He does. I don't say miss a lot, but like he's got to be perfect, and if he's a little bit off, it's a miss. Does that make sense what I'm saying? So I've kind of come full circle a little bit. I still have my doubts about the prospect playing tackle, but I do think the athletic footwork, hip dexterity, and just general pop to his body, just general twitch to his body is very, very good. He's played a lot of football, right? Kind of fitting in that mold. And if Travell thinks he can get him there, I'm going to trust Travell on that. You know what I mean? So that's kind of my thought on him.
Yeah. So where does that then leave the offensive line? Starting
Right.
wise, Leno at left tackle. You have this battle royale at left guard. Chris Paul. Who else in there? What's his name?
Sadiq
Sadiq.
Charles.
Norwell is still technically there, although everyone anticipates he's not going to be there much longer. At center, you have the four guys that we've talked about. Right guard is Cosme, right tackle is Wiley. Do you think that they're now looking in second wave free agency to add someone else, to add another veteran? Like what, or do you, and if not, is that good enough on the offensive line?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think I would have probably gone someone, position flex is big for them. So I do think Daniels, like we talked about, like I've talked to coaches who thinks he can play center. I think he can play guard. They obviously think he can play tackle. So he does bring some position flex, which they value. At some point, I probably am just going to draft a tackle. I think Ty Warren is his name from Pittsburgh was on the board. He reminds me a lot of Morgan Moses in the fourth round. I think he can be a starting caliber player. Had an injury the fourth game of this last season at Pittsburgh. And prior to the injury, looked like he was going to be a first round draft pick. And that guy's on the board, and he's a true tackle. You lose some of the position flex, but I would like to have a guy with that skill set on the roster. Now you do have Cornelius Lucas, right? He's still on the
Mm-hmm.
roster. He's
I
he's an
believe so. Yeah.
excellent swing tackle, very very good. Can come in a pinch, but you really only have three guys that can play true tackle. Four guys if you think Braden Daniels can do it. If Braden Daniels can do it, I think you feel much better about where the offensive line is at. But like I said, I do have some reservation about where he's at and where he needs to go from a consistency standpoint to kind of establish himself as a guy who can play tackle in the NFL. Because they do this pretty regularly. They brought in Sadiq Charles, tackle ends up moving a guard. Chris Paul, tackle ends up moving a guard, right? Sam Cosme, tackle ends up moving a guard. And he is very much in that same mold of guy. I will say he's got a little bit shorter of a torso, which helps him kind of sit the power rushes off the edge a little bit better. Like think about Morgan Moses, Trent Williams, like literally any good tackle. They've got kind of this really tight torso so they can really kind of brace their midsection. He's got that look about him. But again, it's a little bit of a jump. I think he's physically capable of doing it, but it's a little bit of a jump. And I think he's probably going to settle in at guard, and you kind of run into the same problem where you have four centers, you have, couple developmental
852 guards.
yeah, and that are kind of developmental guys that all have a lot of potential, but none of them have actually done it at a high level in the NFL. And but if Braden can do it, if Braden can play tackle, then you feel much better about it. And again, like I just don't know if they value the tackle position the same way that I do, and that's perfectly fine. But I do think in this era of kind of specialized football, tackles play tackle, guards play guards. There's a reason they're built differently, right? Because they have to handle different athletic, trials and tribulations. Um, I think, I would look for a tackle potentially in the third wave of free agency or second wave, whatever it's called. So
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that, obviously a lot of tackles went over the last couple of days, and that's
yeah,
going to cause some veteran fallout. And is there a chance to get some more, experience in that room and to get it at a tackle spot potentially? But you also do have two veteran tackles. Now, you don't have a lot of depth, but you do have that veteran, know-how, hopefully, at tackle. And the thing that I'll say about this with Wiley, like, and I know you like him better at guard, and maybe he is better at guard. But Eric Bieniemy's coached him, and Eric Bieniemy is the OC, and Eric Bieniemy brought him here. And we agree on this. The best offseason acquisition the Washington Commanders made was Eric Bieniemy. He's
yeah,
going to make literally everyone better. And if Eric Bieniemy trusts Andrew Wiley at right tackle, fan on Twitter who watched a little bit of tape and read one PFF article, you don't know as much about Andrew Wiley as Eric Bieniemy does. And I say that respectfully, but like, neither do I. Neither does Logan. And, Logan knows a lot. I know a little bit. And you might too on your couch. But like, we don't combined know as much about Andrew Wiley specifically, who's coached him every day for the last couple of years, as Eric Bieniemy. So if Bieniemy's cool with him at right tackle, I'm just going to kind of default for right now. And if we're wrong about that by the time October, November rolls around, then that's Eric Bieniemy, and at that point they're probably not having a great season, and this staff is not going to be long for their jobs. That's just the reality of this 2023 season with the ownership situation and everything else going on.
And I just want to make a point of clarification. Like, I do think Wiley can play tackle, especially with
Yeah.
Eric Bieniemy calling plays, because Eric Bieniemy knows what he's good at and knows how to insulate him. Like, for example, like Tyler Columbus was here in Washington and had a very productive year in 2012 because Kyle knew how to call games to fit his skill sets, right, and to elevate him. And I do think that that's what you're going to get a little bit here of. Like, is he a top 10 tackle in the NFL? Probably not. But there are a lot of guys who aren't top 10 tackles in the NFL that are elevated by the play caller and elevated by scheme. He falls in that category, and that's totally fine. And it's the same thing with Leno. Like, I personally think Leno is better. I think he's better than a lot of people think. I think he's like probably a top 15 tackle, which, people probably freak out at. But when you look at him down to down, it's pretty damn good. And so you got two guys that are solid starting caliber tackles in the NFL that will be elevated by a play caller who knows how to utilize play action, who knows how to utilize the screen game, knows how to develop a cultivated rushing attack that insulates the passing game. And I think you're going to be okay. I personally, this is again my personal perspective, and I'm entitled to my opinion. I would like to have a guy going into camp with kind of more tackle-ish traits, which again is my perspective, and they obviously don't think that's necessary. So
Yeah, I would love to have a fourth guy,
yeah,
to
right.
say the least.
And they think Daniels is that guy.
Right,
Like I said,
totally.
there is a world where he is that guy because he does have this tremendous athleticism. I think it's harder for me to see the projection to tackle, but it is possible, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So
The last thing I would add too is I expect the quarterback play to be better this year. Like, I know it's Sam Howell and he's had, 16 NFL passes and the whole deal, but between the play calling and the fact that like how much of their offensive line issues last year were because Carson Wentz held on to the football way too damn long. And like,
quicker release too, like
yeah,
all
like
those kind
Sam
of
gets the
things.
ball out. Like
Yep.
it's part of who he is. Like, will there be games where there might be a lot of sacks because he's young and confused and the defense throws something at him that melts his brain a little bit? Probably he's a second year player. But overall, compared to what Carson did last year, and even Taylor, like, and that was a huge problem with Taylor by the end of the year. He was holding the ball way too long, and so
Right.
you can't go back and the same people complaining about that. Now I'm getting too lost in the internet, Twitter, and YouTube comments and everything. But like, same folks that were complaining about the quarterback play and Scott Turner, when you replace that, like, believe it or not, some of the same players that you're now complaining about will be better. Like that's how that works. So
Absolutely. I
that's
totally agree. And so again, like I think this is okay. I'd like another tackle body, but I think, like you said, the combination of a quarterback with a quicker release, a coordinator that hopefully knows how to elevate that skill set and elevate the skill set of the offensive line. I think you're going to be, and again, the other thing about this offense is I saw something that I think is a beautifully articulate way of talking about offense in the NFL. And I think the head coach for Indianapolis said this and basically said, everyone runs the same passing concepts. The thing that differentiates offense is protections and how nuanced and advanced your protection schemes are. And so if that comes in and if that's executed at a high level, I think you're going to be in a much better spot, because we also got to talk about how, Matt Scout, who I like a lot, I have a lot of respect for, was very traditional in his approach to A, run scheme, and B, protections. So what does this offense look like when you give these guys some more nuance in that department? Hopefully it elevates them also. So I do think there is a path through coaching and through scheme where the whole offense is elevated, and including the offensive line, by enhanced protection and enhanced offensive play calling.
agreed. Take Command podcast from Odyssey Sports. I am Craig Hoffman. He is Logan Paulson. Make sure that wherever you are watching right now, listening right now, if you're a watcher on YouTube, like and subscribe. If you are listening, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, subscribe, follow, whatever the magical button is on that particular mobile application. All right, let's get to the day three, or the rest, I guess, of the day three picks, Logan, starting with KJ Henry. The Clemson program could not rave enough about him. Ross Taylor, who used to be in PR here in Washington and left to go to Clemson, put out a bunch of really nice tweets about KJ, basically saying, like, you guys are going to love him in DC. That is the person, KJ Henry. What about the tape and the football player, KJ Henry?
I think he's good. I think he's a good football player, got good strength in his hands. He's not like one of these edge rushers that is overly long, overly twitched up. Like, he's a good athlete, not a great athlete. He's strong, not crazy strong. He's just a good football player, right? He played a little five technique, which is like inside the tight
Mhm.
end. Played the true kind of wide five where you're rushing off the shoulder of the tackle. Did some good stuff with line stunts in games. He's a good football player. He's a good football player, instinctive. He plays hard. I think he's good. I think he's a really good value here at this spot. I can see why they targeted him, especially given the character that you were talking about and referencing. So, I like him. I think he's a good football player, and I like good football players. And I think the one thing about this list so far is, despite all this stuff, you've gotten guys who are passionate, motivated, and have an instinctive understanding of football at a high level. Daniels, I think, is maybe questionable in terms of instincts, but in terms of athletic traits and passion for the game, that shows up with all of these guys. And so I think he just fits perfectly with kind of the themes of their draft, which again we talked about earlier last week. And so I think, yeah, I think he's going to be an excellent addition. I think he's probably going to play a little bit, quite a bit of football for this team, in that D line rotation.
Yeah, definitely. And it fits what they typically do at D line, right? They just get like guys who fit the bill from Power Five programs.
Yes.
Every single dude except for FA,
Yeah.
who obviously is his incredibly unique story. But every other guy in that room is like Stanford, NC State, Alabama, Ohio State, Mississippi State. Like
Yeah.
they like Power Five big dudes who know how to get after it. And
Yeah.
KJ Henry fits that mold coming from Clemson for sure.
And
You
yep.
mentioned the D line rotation, like where does he kind of fit in that? Like, obviously, Chase and Montez are your starters. I
Yeah.
think James is kind of firmly the third guy. Casey's right after that. Like, will KJ be taking snaps from a Casey Hill potentially this
I,
year?
I I think that's entirely possible. I also think, maybe James. He's a good
Yeah,
football player. We got to see how he fits in this scheme. Because he's not. Again, you mentioned Power Five. I think that's a really good analysis, right? They have a type. He's not as big as some of those other guys. He's like in that 250, 255 range, and even Casey, who's not a big DN by any stretch of the imagination, weighs 260. So he's a little bit of a. He's tall though, 6'5". He's got the
right.
frame, got the traits. It's just about how that comes together and how he kind of establishes his role in this rotation. Like because Casey has a role, James has a role, Fa has a role, and so what will his role be in this rotation? And it's hard to know because he was kind of a jack of all trades, master of none. Like he's a decent pass rusher, he's decent against the run. You want him on your team, but like where does that fit in? It's a little different than Andre Jones, who has a very specific skill set. What is KJ Henry's skill set, I guess.
Yeah, but look, hey, if he's kind of a jack of all trades, master of none, like that's a great depth piece. Like,
And he's good,
hey,
and he's good,
James is out this week, Casey's out this week. Like,
right,
you're gonna play their snaps, and unfortunately, D line, like that happens. Guys miss games. If all those dudes play every single week, there will have been a miracle that has happened. So,
right,
someone who can kind of fill in all those different roles and understand all those spots, like at the end of your depth chart, that's almost what you want.
right. And that was the big thing for this draft for Ron, was getting some depth pieces, and I think he does an excellent job of that. I think that's great analysis, Craig, because it's like, James missed a whole bunch of time last year. Casey missed some time with a concussion. James had a concussion late in the year. Fa missed time, and so it's nice to have a guy who, I can play first and second down. I can be your drop end. I can be your spinner in certain situations, right? And I think the spinner stuff is probably a little. And spinner is okay. So just for people who know, like Fa at times was kind of this guy that would come in on third down and be this power rusher. He might line up inside, outside. I don't know if he has that type of ability, but he does have some pass rush upside. So again, I think that's really, again, a guy that can, unlike, just to compare him to Shaka Tony, Shaka could only do one thing,
Right.
and this guy is not that way. And I think that's, again, a perfect depth piece for this team.
So let's skip around real quick because it's the same position. Let's go to Andre Jones, also an edge. Talk about pass rush juice. This seems to be the Shaka Tony replacement with Shaka suspended for the year.
Right. It does seem to be the Shaka Tony replacement, but I think he's a guy that when you look at his traits, like from an analytics perspective, 6'5", I think he's 245, 250. I've seen different numbers, but a big, well put together guy, 44.5-inch arms, so very long arms for his size and weight.
That's nuts.
He had a 98th percentile wingspan, so just a very kind of a guy that can add a lot of weight to his frame. dropped a lot, kind of as a Sam linebacker in the 3-4 defense that they played there in Louisiana. For a while when I was first watching, I was like, do they want this guy to play off-ball linebacker? And then when you look at his measurables as a rusher, his 10-yard split, like that stuff is all kind of elite in that area. So his production may not have been, crazy because he's playing kind of this Sam edge. He's like rushing from a squared 2-point stance, which is not the most effective way to do that. But he has some juice, has some ability, good power. He's older. He's like 25 years old. So as a developmental prospect, that's a little, I don't know, unusual maybe. But in terms of, again, that profile, you match that in, and that's elite edge rusher profile. And so you kind of say you're taking a flyer on a guy in the 7th. You ensure that he's on your team, and you say, okay, he's going to he has the ability to project to something that I think like a guy like, James Smith, not James Smith Williams, Bradley King or Shaka Tony never could. Yeah, so I really like this signing, especially late. And again, I like the fact that he can drop. I think he's too stiff to play off-ball linebacker, but like when you in terms of finding a role for him on the defense, maybe you could find something like that that's a little bit more space centric. But yeah,
but also sounds like a guy that can play special teams,
yeah,
which is where Shaka, when he got on the field, was mostly on the field. Like he can
and
be
I
on the
like
punt
him
team.
better. He's
Yeah.
more physical. He's like he's got a little more drive to his game, if that makes
Yeah.
sense. Like Shaka kind of had like a little bit of an apathy when he was out there. I think football was important to Shaka, but this guy's got like like a Casey Hill, James Smith Williams mentality. They finish plays, they play hard, and I like that a little bit more from a developmental standpoint.
Yeah, I also say this on the age thing. Like, it's just the reality of like this draft is probably the last one. There'll be a couple stragglers next year, but like we're getting to the end of guys who had COVID years,
Yeah,
and there's just a bunch of older players that got caught up in COVID years and transfers and this and that, and we're kind of at the end of that where you're going to now have older guys being 23, 24 as opposed to 25, and Stetson
26
Bennett's
and
26.
Yeah.
So that's just the reality of kind of the last few years that we've been through here on planet Earth. All right, last guy, going back to round 6, Chris Rodriguez, super physical downhill runner. Not the type of back I expected them to take. I expected the scat back, third down type of guy.
But they did get that guy in a UDFA, the kid from UCLA. His name escapes me at the moment. It'll come
I'll
to
look
me
it
in a
up real
minute.
quick.
Yeah.
Although your Bruin Alumni Association card is
Revoked. Yeah.
revoked.
I don't
Almost
watch
as
a
bad
lot.
as Howie Roseman's Florida card after drafted all these Georgia guys.
But yeah. So so let's just talk about Chris Rodriguez. He is a fun football player to watch, and he is such. I remember I talked to Maurice Jones-Drew at the combine. You were there for some of it, Craig, and I remember talking to Maurice, and I was reminded about the standard for the running back position when I was at UCLA. The standard for the running back position that Maurice Jones-Drew experienced for his 4 years at UCLA, and then in his continued relationship with EB. And when I watch Chris Rodriguez, like he does that stuff. He's excellent in pass protection. He's physical in that regard. He blocks well in space. Not a ton of opportunity, but he blocks well in space. He runs and he finishes runs with a violence, an explosion. Pacheco is the guy that kind of is the most recent Eric Bieniemy find. He's got that kind of, you hit me, I'm exploding into this contact. There's the perfect play against Mississippi State, in my estimation, is he has this run where he gets through, he breaks an arm tackle at the line of scrimmage, and the safety comes up to fit, and there's a linebacker hanging on Rodriguez's hip, and he delivers an absolute punishing blow on the safety. The very next play in this cut-up I was watching, it's the same safety. He hits the hole clean, and the safety just says, I have no desire to have any part of this hit. Takes a creative angle. Rodriguez hits it off for a 50-yard run. And you see the short area quickness. You see the short area burst. Doesn't have the long speed necessarily, but much like Pacheco, like explodes through the line of scrimmage. Good vision, comes from an NFL-style rushing attack already, so there's not going to be a lot of turnover there in terms of developmental stuff. Catches the football well, not like receiver good, but for a running back, very high level in that regard. So I just see a really well-rounded back. And the thing that is kind of scary about the process for me is I'm like, man, they can just throw big bodies at defenses. And this is something I've toyed with for a long time. Like everyone says, oh, I want a power back and a scat back. But what if you just said, screw it, and just said, we're going to launch big bodies into your face for 30 carries a game. Like, what is that going to do to the defense? B Rob stays healthy. He stays healthy because they're each getting 15 touches. And it's just like two battering rams. And I don't
Right.
think anyone's really done this like this for a while. And it's a scary thought. And I also think it's really good for Gibson because it says, hey, you are officially going to be more a part of our passing attack. And it's not like Gibson's a shrieking violet anyway.
No, I
He's
think people forget because of his like receiver background. Dude's like 220, 225.
I think
AG's
he's
huge.
he's big fella. So having a backfield like this is very daunting. And again, it's a little unconventional, but I'm also kind of like, if you want a third down back, maybe that's where you say, hey, Curtis Samuel, pop back here. We'll run choices with you back here, or
Right.
Gibson will do it with you, and we'll bring in Armani Rogers to play that third receiver role, or whatever, or however that shakes out. So I
Yeah,
don't know.
they
I
got to
just look
figure
at
out the pass pro part of the third down back. That's the one
right,
that is a little. I mean, I was spoiled when I was on the beat because I had Chris Thompson who missed one assignment in 6 years.
right.
Like that's who CT was. Like he was so freaking solid. He just never missed. And there were times that he got stuck on. I remember one play they were playing the Jets one year, and he got face full of Leonard Williams, and you're
You're
just
right.
like, all right, well, he stuck his nose in there and like
Yeah,
he
yeah.
slowed him up. And like
Right.
that's the kind of stuff that CT would do. And I don't know if they have that. And I don't know if Rodriguez is a guy who's gonna stick his face in there. I mean, it sounds
He's
like he's
he's
got the physicality, but like
he's excellent in
it's
pass pro.
it's the
Excellent in pass pro.
mental it's not just I shouldn't say the mentality, it's the mental processing to know like this is my guy. That's where a lot of running backs get messed up. It's not necessarily just a willingness to put your face in there, it's knowing where to put your face. And
Yeah.
so that is the thing he'll have to learn. And AG, I think, is probably the guy they're going to want to continue to grow in that space because he's also such a threat as a receiver. But like you said, like you stick Curtis back there and run the choice routes. You can do different kinds of things with the personnel that they have. And I would anticipate, frankly, like Terry and Jahan getting some snaps out of the backfield too, in the way they used to with Tyreek, where they're not necessarily a threat to run it, but it just makes like you can't press them. There's things that cause problems because of that alignment that EB has toyed with in Kansas City for a long time, that I would imagine he does the same. By the way, the guy who you're talking about, I think, is Casimir Allen, who is officially listed as a wide receiver out of UCLA, but he was their punt return, kick return
Yeah.
guy, which is another position that I'm glad got addressed in some way, shape, or form, because that was an issue for them last year. There was just no pop in either one of the return games. AG had a little bit for a while at kick return, but there was just not enough pop in the return game last year. And if this guy can come in, make the team as the last wide receiver, and then ultimately be a special teamer and the return guy, like that would be very, 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 very nice.
And the reason he's listed as like a running back receiver is because he basically played receiver, but he also had like 3 or 4 games where he played running back against Arizona State, and then I think maybe USC. I forget exactly, where he was able to clip off some very explosive runs. Kind of, like when you watch him, it kind of reminds you of. This is a very lofty comparison, but Tyreek Hill when he was playing running back at Kansas City. A guy that has some explosive ability, can move around the formation. I don't know if that's his role from day one, but he kind of reminds you of like the kid from Oregon, Mamba. I forget his name exactly, but you remember what I'm
Oh,
talking about.
yeah.
Like
I know exactly who you're talking
like
about. I can't remember his name.
super quick, super good acceleration. The long speed's not necessarily there, but like a playmaker. And so I do think if
Yeah.
that's the addition to the backfield, that's the addition to this offense. That could potentially turn into something depending on how the training camp goes. But in terms of Rodriguez, I like him. He's good. He's an excellent running back, and him and B Rob, wearing down defenses is going to be a hell of a thing to watch.
Definitely. All right. Just overall final thoughts. I'll go first real quick. I don't think they hit like grand slam. Oh my God. Like people aren't going to celebrate them like they're celebrating the Eagles draft. And that's fine. The chances are that the Eagles draft won't turn out to be quite as genius as it looks now, because that tends to be how those things go. Although,
Yep.
God, they got a lot of talent. But there's a reason like Keely Ringo fell. But if the Eagles get the best out of him, they're going to look like geniuses. Doesn't mean Keely Ringo would have been successful anywhere else, but the Commanders don't necessarily, it looks like today, have that kind of draft. But they've continued a very methodical offseason plan that I think makes a lot of sense. Like they know what they're doing. And what I at least appreciate about this staff right now is they are not taking wild swings to try to gamify short-term success, knowing that their jobs are on the line. They have a plan. This plan would have looked a lot better if they had run it in year 1 versus year 4, but they have a plan. They are sticking to it. And I think it's ultimately a good plan. I don't know if it'll be enough to save their jobs, but they're going to try. And I think Ron will hard sell Josh Harris on like, hey man, we're doing things the right way. Give us a chance to run this out. And ultimately it's going to come down to Sam Howell. That is absolutely the case going into the draft. It
Yeah.
is the case coming out of the draft. That was never going to change in the draft, no matter how many national people wanted them to take a quarterback. Like, this is the plan. This is their best chance for success. I think there's maybe some flaws in a little bit of the execution, like you said. Like, an offensive tackle probably would have been nice, but alas, the way the board fell, they didn't feel that way.
Yeah.
And they ultimately made their team better. And I think that better is good. And especially when you were on the verge of the playoffs last year, and a huge reason why you missed is your offensive coordinator and your quarterback, and you've changed those two positions out. I think there's reason to be optimistic. Not necessarily
Yeah.
championship optimistic, but like, I think they're a better football team now than they were at the end of last season. And that's what you want.
Yeah, and I really like the defensive additions in this draft. I really love the first two picks. I think that's going to make this defense super scary. There was a period of time, I think, I don't remember the exact statistic. You probably help me remember, Craig, where they led the NFL in pressures for like 10 weeks in a row. And now with these coverage players, like, think about what that does in terms of sack production, and think about what sack production does for your offense in terms of field position. So I think this is cool. It's an exciting opportunity from a defensive standpoint. Offensively, we talked about some of our reservations. I do think Ricky Stromberg is going to be an excellent football player here. Fill out a role nicely, allow you to get cheaper and younger at a position. And I think Braeden Daniels, if he hits, like, to me, he's the linchpin for the draft. If he becomes your swing guy, if he adds some rotational depth, if he does end up playing tackle for you, like, that will be absolutely huge. So that, to me, that's the thing I'm going to be watching really closely, because I really think I really have no questions in terms of how these other guys are going to be as pros. Maybe Andre Jones because small school, whatever.
Yeah, but he's a seventh round pick. Like,
Yeah,
he might
but
not make the roster, and that doesn't matter because he's a
but
seventh round pick. That's what
right,
happens.
but I think Emmanuel Forbes, Tre'Tavious Martin, Ricky Stromberg, KJ Henry, and Chris Rodriguez are going to play a lot of football for this team. And
Yeah.
if Braeden Daniels hits and is that guy, kind of swing tackle guy with some upside that to be more, because he's, again, has those elite athletic traits. I'm like, this draft's pretty excellent. So
Yeah.
much like last year, kind of, I don't want to say playing it safe, but definitely leaning into the character, leaning into quality human beings, and definitely picking some high floor guys, which I have absolutely no problem with.
Yeah. I'll add one other thing. There's another guy that this season, to a point, if like they want to be really, really good, hinges on, and that guy's Chase Young.
Yeah.
And like, when you have the number 2 pick in the draft, as the Houston Texans just did, and you see what some of the other teams have done with those super high top 5, top 3 picks in recent years, when those guys hit, they can change your franchise.
Yep.
And Chase, he's had the injury, but now it's time. And both for him personally and for this franchise, it's going to come down to Sam Howell on offense, which can be insulated and helped by a lot of different factors, mainly Eric Bieniemy, but then the line, et cetera. And then if Chase Young turns into a superstar on defense, this defense should be scary good.
Yeah.
And if not, then they should still be fairly good.
I mean, think about what they were without him there, and
Right.
again, like they're an
Right.
excellent defense with him, like without him there. And if he takes that step that everyone's kind of hoping
The
and
difference in
praying
them being a top 10, like really good borderline playoff team, fighting down to the end, and like, whoa, Washington Commanders didn't see this coming.
yes, like that. I mean, that's really like what you're talking about is one player on offense, one player on defense. Because quite frankly, like when you go back to Chase, we just talked about the draft. When you talk about Chase's college tape, it's elite. If he gets there, this front will be incredible, especially with the secondary helping out in the back end. Like,
Yeah.
it's a really cool opportunity. So
Definitely. All right, we'll keep going back and taking a look at this draft. We'll probably do it with a guest later this week or next week. And then OTAs right around the corner. So we'll see these guys on the field for the first time. Rookie minicamp is right around the corner as well. So we'll have definite coverage of that. In the meantime, make sure you are subscribed wherever you are watching or listening right now. If you're watching on YouTube and you haven't yet, hit that like button for us. Helps us out. Send it to a friend even. Let them be like, hey, this thing that I liked, you would
should
like
like too. Yeah.
Yeah. So with that, for more from Logan on Instagram at Logan_Paulson82. I'm on Twitter at Craig Hoffman, and I'll see y'all on the radio at 4 o'clock, 4 to 7 each and every day. on the Team 980. That's it. That's all for this edition of Take Command. See you later this week.
Thanks for watching this clip of Take Command. First, why don't you like it? It lets other people know that it was good, and then they should watch it too. And Logan, we have a new exclusive home for full episodes.
We do. 1067 The Fans YouTube page. Go check it out and please subscribe.
Yeah, do what Logan said.
Do it.
Very, very smart.